You're on.
Oh,
Here we are.
here we go.
Just like that. 5 minutes counts down, and bam, mics come on. Mid-sentence. It's always good. We're usually not saying anything that we don't want anybody to hear.
Sometimes.
I'm just kidding. We're never saying anything we don't want anybody to hear. I've actually been told that sometimes the internet hears us early, so they hear us telling each other what we're getting ready to say, and they think it's funny. Anyway, welcome back. We're still in Joseph.
Yeah. I remember when he talks about Joseph being 39. I remember we had just gotten our son David 6 weeks before that. Got him in the hospital when he was 4 days old. And we went to a restaurant, Shoney's, I believe it was, back in those days. And we were on our way that Sunday to take him back and show him to the 11th Street congregation where we had been working. And Juanita went to the restroom, and the waitress came over and said, had a cute little boy, how old is your grandson? So that happened to us several times because the first date we had, Juanita's father said, he must have been 30, he's about 35 years old. She said, no, he's only 26. I saw his driver's license. Well, she was 19, and Juanita looked like she was 17 when she was 19. So we had to go through that for a long time. Anyway,
there's a story, but I'm going to skip mine.
Huh? 39 rings a big bell with me.
Yeah, well, that's good. That's good. There's a story there, but I'm going to skip it.
Right.
So, 22 years though that he has not seen his brothers. In that 39, that's where I while you were telling it, I was thinking the other direction, which is how many years has he been gone from 17 to 39, and so. Yeah.
So that's why it kind of stands out with me, because when I was 17, I had hair. When I was 39, I didn't have a lot of hair.
Yeah, that I get. All right, so moving on. We're going into 41. We're continuing the story. Last week we talked about, much, but we had some connectors or some teasers for this week. And rather than review anything, because we really don't have time, we're just going to jump right in. So Genesis 41 recounts how Joseph's fortunes turned when the chief cupbearer remembered him. Remember, we looked at last week, he was forgotten. That was in the sermon last week too. But he is remembered. And it's interesting to me how that, we read past it sometimes kind of quickly, but it says in the text that the cupbearer remembered his sins, depending upon which translation you're reading. And then it tells you in the next sentence, there was this guy in prison that interpreted our dreams. And I've always wondered, maybe you have some opinion, I've always wondered if the sins he's remembering are what landed him in jail, or that he forgot Joseph. Which is it? Or is it both? So, I don't know if you've thought about that, but I used to think of that as a kid, thinking that I couldn't really tell what it was actually saying. So anyway, he remembers him, and then he tells Pharaoh that he was able to interpret their dreams, which we looked at last week. And so Pharaoh says, well, summon this guy and bring him to me, because he's got these two dreams that none of his magi that we talked about last week can interpret. And so Joseph replied to Pharaoh, it is not within my power but God to speak concerning the welfare of Pharaoh. And I just put that back in because we had said last week that this is an ancient Near East normal type situation for there to be dreams and dreams to be interpreted, and they often were about people's well-being. And so the biblical text is affirming all of that Joseph is saying it's not me, it's Yahweh who interprets dreams, but it is about the well-being of Pharaoh and his land, I would say.
Right.
So Pharaoh's dreams, you remember, were these cows. We had some good pictures in the sermon this morning. I liked the one that Les had where the cows ate the other cows and the skeletons were on the ground. I didn't see that one. But this was what we used last week for those, the sheaves. And then I put that kind of cracked desert ground there on your right because that's what a famine looks like. Everything's just dried up. It's kind of like, I'm sure you could talk to us about this. It's sort of like your family would have told stories, I guess, of like 1929, like what it was like in the Dust Bowl, here, right? That's about the only thing I can think of in this country that might come close to what was getting ready to happen in Egypt. Is that fair?
Yeah, my I had a relative in the early 40s who started a business. And anyway, mother and I were talking about it one day. And she said that when she was a young girl, that the dust was so deep around Woodbury area that she'd be working in the fields, and the dust would be 4 or 5 inches deep.
Wow. I just can't, I have never experienced anything like that. I can't imagine what that would be like. And yet I would think 7 years of dust would be even worse.
And one year at Beichan, we were walking around the backside, come in, and they'd had a drought for quite a while. And we walked through dust that was about 3 or 4 inches deep.
Wow.
That was a surprise.
So Pharaoh is looking a little perturbed here. Joseph said to Pharaoh, both dreams of the Pharaoh have the same meaning, which is interesting. He just says that right off the top. He says, God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows represent 7 years of good. The text just says 7 years there. And the lean cows represent 7 years of famine. And so the grain, same thing. And that's Genesis 41, 25 through 26. The 7 lean, bad-looking cows that came up after them represented 7 years, as do the 7 empty grains of grains burned with the east wind, which is interesting. So the weather is causing, there's something that's setting in on the land that's going to make it basically parched, and then it can't produce anything. And they represent 7 years of famine. This is what I told Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the whole land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will occur after them, and all the abundance will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will devastate the land. Abundance being forgotten tells you just how terrible the famine was and for how long, that you would forget. I mean, that, if you think about it, that's almost a decade. I mean, you can forget things in a decade, or you have to at least sit down and purposefully remember what it was like 10 years ago on something. So I guess that's another place that we've read the text kind of fast. So I went to one of my life things, with cars. It's kind of like the service engine light soon's come on for Pharaoh. What are you going to do? If you ignore it, you're going to end up with a major problem. And if you don't ignore it, you're going to have to plan, because it's a major undertaking. In other words, the reason I thought this was sort of funny is that if your engine has to be serviced soon and you've got a $20,000 engine, you've got to make a decision on fixing it. If you don't do anything about it, then you have a car that's worth nothing and basically can't take you anywhere. So in a weird way, the life of the car is in jeopardy with the checked engine soon. The life of Egypt as a people is in jeopardy with this famine, right?
We just really have a hard time now understanding famines. When you go to Egypt to visit, as several people know, and been to Egypt to visit, there's just lots of places where, if the Nile didn't do its thing every year,
didn't flood.
It was just really a difficult situation. If it overflooded, things were difficult. If it didn't flood like it's supposed to, things were difficult. And I remember flying the first time I flew from Cairo down to Aswan, looking down and seeing, and the Nile was blue because there's almost no clouds there. So I looking at it and seeing the blue Nile down there, and green about 2 or 3 miles on each side, and then nothing but desert. Nothing but desert the rest of the way.
Which is why the Nile is sometimes referred to in ancient writing as life, because if it wasn't there, there wouldn't be life for the area. The other interesting thing about this graphic, and even in what it says in the text, God would make it happen soon, is the word soon. He didn't say you've got X number of days to prepare. So this plan that Joseph comes up with has got to be basically implemented immediately, because they don't know how quickly the famine is going to arrive, right?
Yeah, the Pharaoh, when he listened to Joseph's explanations, it made sense to him. He had a lot of explanations. The other wise men and people who'd come in. He asked them, and they gave their opinion apparently, but they just didn't have any confidence, and he didn't have confidence in what they were saying. And so that's why when the cupbearer said, Joseph told us our dreams, and he was right on the money.
Yeah, and that's here is, what do we do? Well, Joseph tells him. And I find it interesting that he doesn't really say, oh, I have the plan. He just says, here's what you should do.
Right.
In the text, this morning in the sermon, we went a little quickly through that. There's actually a little section that we kind of leapfrogged over, which is, just for a minute, there's indecision about who this person would be. It's not instantly Joseph. It's Pharaoh saying, well, where can we find somebody we'll have this plan like this that would be like Joseph. And then it kind of, I think, dawns on him as he's speaking through it that Joseph is probably the guy. Right. But it didn't start that way. It wasn't just immediately putting him in charge. It was think through it, heard the plan, agree with the plan, think through the plan. Who in the world can do this? Well, maybe we should just let the guy who said the plan do it. So Pharaoh promotes Joseph because God enabled him to know the meaning of Pharaoh's dreams. And that's what we said last week. We said that these magi people, these divining priests were some of the terms that we had in last week's lesson. They were so highly regarded that when they got things right like this, they were promoted very highly, which could also have been the frustration and stress of all the ones not being able to get this. Because I'm sure it would go the other way. You get too many things you predict wrong, and your confidence drops, and your ranking drops too. So Joseph goes straight to number 2. This photo you put in here, it's putting the signet ring on his hand, so now he has check writing authority, the jewelry around his neck, and probably some sort of, later in different pictures, some sort of head dressing probably too. I mean, he gets all of the garb that goes with the position to be able to make the decisions, right?
Yeah, Joseph had to be an impressive person because, like you say, every time that he gets in position, he rises. He impressed his father from the standpoint that he made him the crown sheik. Mm-hmm. He impressed the Pharaoh.
Potiphar.
Potiphar first, and then he impressed the jailer, the warden of the jail.
And now Pharaoh. Exactly.
Now Pharaoh.
So here's another image of what it might have looked like. It probably was a ceremony. We don't know for sure, but I would imagine that it wasn't just like, okay, here are the keys, here's your key, start tomorrow. It was probably more of an installment so that the people in the land knew that this was a guy that they had to listen to and had the authority to do things in the name of Pharaoh.
And what we have to keep in mind is that what we have in the text is always only a small part. Sometimes there's a long conversation and discussion, and a lot of things are said, but the Bible has to give us, in a sense, a Reader's Digest version, or it would be the size of the Encyclopedia Britannica.
And we already have people who say it's too long, so if it was even longer, that could be problematic. And then you had this one, Joseph in charge of Egypt, and people, obviously reflecting that they understand that. We don't know how many people bowed. Bowing was not like in the East. It wasn't the greeting in Egypt, so I'm not sure how many times people would have bowed down. I think it was more of like his brothers bowing to him was because of their situation, right? Not necessarily that every time Joseph went out in town, everybody stopped and bowed. So what did Pharaoh do? Well, Joseph began building storehouses, and Egypt had grain for themselves and sold it to foreigners, and people from every country came to Joseph to buy grain. That right there is amazing, that as Les pointed out this morning, it went so much was collected, and they put away so much they couldn't even count it all, so the accountants just said, we've got plenty. And yet, by the time we get through with this morning, they don't, because, well, at least the families don't. Egypt does, but the famine runs so long that even what was distributed to people for payment, now they don't have any money, and they've run out of food. But Egypt still has food, which is just fascinating that is there. And there's a lot of different opinions. I actually got into this and didn't put didn't put too much into this presentation about what those storehouses looked like. There's kind of two camps, which we'll get some pictures here in a second. But here's maybe Joseph doing that inventory, and then here's what I think we were comfortable with saying the storehouses probably look like, right? You've got have you been to the building up in the upper right? Have you been to that storehouse in the upper right photo?
I have.
I thought so. And you can still see those carvings that are on it today,
Right.
and they think that's one of Joseph's storehouses, right?
Some people feel that way.
Okay, so there it is. Some people feel that way. There's also pictures on the internet you can get of these Joseph storehouses that are pyramid shaped, and so some people believe that those are Joseph's storehouses.
Right.
So
Not likely.
probably not. But in any case, you can see in the bottom right from the little cartoon there, he's starting to give reports per se to Pharaoh, saying, "Here's our status. Here's how much we've already put away. Here's different." Well, this is different. You have info on this, right?
Yeah. What happened? We have a series here where we're trying to show you something about Egypt. At the same time, we said, well, why not show them a real picture? I mean, this is one of their real papyri that you can look at, and so we're going to show you lots of guesses and cartoons. But here's a picture of things really happening in Egypt.
And so you see the bags there spanned on the rods between the people carrying them would be the grain, and you see the grain being emptied, I guess, at the top, right? Yeah. And you see them sorting it, right? Not sure I totally understand the bottom picture. Now they don't have grain, and they've got some trees looking barren there in the background. So I wasn't sure if you had more info on that or not.
Right. Okay.
But the point is, as Dr. Cloud just said, you've got all these different places that they're storing all this grain, and they've got just an unbelievable amount. Joseph was 30 and would be 36 or close to 37 when the famine began, as we heard this morning, and that's the same math that you...
Yeah, usually we say 30 and 37, but that's 8 years. People don't realize that's
Right.
30 to 37 is 8 years, so I put it, I just kind of made it 36 or close to 37.
Yeah. And during the 7 years of plenty, Joseph was married to Asnath, right? I said that right? Yep. And had 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, who would father 2 northern tribes. But this gets interesting. Manasseh is connected with God helping Joseph with forgetting the difficult years between age 17 and 30. You got more you can expound on that? How so? Just because of the blessing?
Yeah, and those had to be tough years, missing his father, missing his younger brother, maybe missing some of his other brothers, missing a lot of people. It had to be a very frustrating period of time during those 30 years. And I'm sure some days he said, well, God, why aren't you answering my prayers? I mean, he had to go through periods like that. And but all of this is going to make all that go away. There's a lot of things that happen to people. People lose a child, and then they're blessed to have another child later on. They go through 2 or 3 years of suffering, and then they get a child. Now they can concentrate on that child. Helps them forget the disaster that they had.
Sure.
So
that makes sense. And then Ephraim comes along, and he's connected with God making Joseph fruitful and productive in the land of his suffering, which, like we were looking at this morning, once out of prison, now second in command of the land, the suffering is definitely over. He's in a position now where he's got family, he's got power, he has influence, and he's got the plan that's keeping all of the people alive, which is, I don't know how it could have gone much better at that point. And so you had this picture, I remember this from one of your classes actually, where you're just showing the excitement and the happiness of a second child being born there. And then I stuck this in. I thought this might help. This kind of shows, because what we're getting ready to look at is something that I guess is not really problematic, but it usually doesn't get covered. We have Joseph and his wife there at the top, and Ephraim and Manasseh, and then you see all the people who are from Ephraim and Manasseh, and those are the ones we don't usually hear much about, right?
Yeah.
Because, well, go ahead.
We don't usually, there's really not a tribe of Joseph. Sometimes it'll talk about the tribe, talk about Joseph being used for the north, because the 2 main tribes in the north were Ephraim and Manasseh. And we almost always say Ephraim and Manasseh. The children were born in
Manasseh.
reverse.
Yeah.
Manasseh was born first, and then Ephraim was born. It's Jacob who's going to cross his arms and bless them the other way.
Exactly. And here's what is interesting. I think I have it up there. 7 years of abundance came and went. Then the 7 years of famine began. The famine extended outside of Egypt to other lands. Joseph and the famine. Let me check and see. No, okay, I must have not put it in here. I was just going to ask you. So going back to this. So what's fascinating is the sons of Manasseh and Ephraim are not in the lineage of promise. And they don't really factor back into the biblical story in a positive way, anyway.
And we had a note that we didn't dwell on, but Ephraim's name means fruitful. So here he's now having a second child, and so not only does the first child help him forget all the troubles he has, that a lot of positive things are happening. One of my students from Amridge did a gospel meeting in Texas last week, and he told me a really sad story, and yet there's a positive thing to this. He was telling about one of the ladies showed him her new baby, or the baby 6 months old now. She had COVID 4 years ago and became blind. And so the child, she's never seen the child and never will see the child. And yet, in spite of that, this child has helped her to forget her blindness. I mean, that sounds strange.
Wow.
But she is so excited about having this child, even though she will never see the child unless there's some kind of special operation. It was a touching story to me.
Yeah, that's amazing. So then you went and had another one of your blue screens that, and after them 7 years of famine, maybe not, I don't know who typed that, will come. Oh, that's in the middle of the sentence. Sorry. After them 7 years of famine will come, and all the abundance will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will ravage the land. It was just a different version of what we had up there 2 slides ago.
You thought it was bad English for a minute.
Yeah, I was like, who wrote this? And then you had this stela, the famine stela. Tell us about that.
Well, a while ago I was telling you, there were lots of famines in Egypt, and they actually have a couple of monuments that talk about them. And here is a stela that is telling about a famine, and it's actually carved on a rock. I've never seen it in person. I didn't see it. I'm not quite sure where it is, but anyway, it's this rock, and I guess they could move it to a museum or something, but they just left it out there. And it's telling about, describing a 7-year famine that's similar to the one that is in this Joseph story. So that's why I decided to put that in there.
Yeah, that's great. Maybe we can go see it sometime. And then here was another feast and famine, Joseph in Egypt, with Joseph, and then the classical, that I've never really researched the wolf type head dressing there, but the ankh that's around its neck for life and everything, I do understand that. So that's kind of the clash of Yahweh represented by Joseph, and then their gods represented by all of their icons, I guess.
Yeah, that little symbol on it looks like the stomach's hanging from the top. That's called an ankh, and it means it's indicating life, and it's in the name of a lot of pharaohs. One pharaoh took Ankuman, king that we call him King Tut. His middle name is Ankh.
Interesting. There's another shot of the famine stela up close. You can see the artwork there at the top, and then all of the writing. And then this is hieroglyphics.
Yeah, I thought you'd take a quick look at hieroglyphics. We were down in Chapel Hill yesterday, and have a niece that we were chatting and talking about school. I think she's a freshman in high school, and she just doesn't like English and doesn't like some of the subjects. And so we started talking about it. I said, well, I used to be that way. I used to not like English grammar, blah, blah, blah. and I showed her where the alphabet came from, and she got really excited about that. And actually, I've been over to Duncan's school and lectured in different classes, and people get really excited about it. But anyway, uh, hieroglyphs are one of the most complicated languages, but it's a picture language. It starts out as a pictograph, and then it develops, the pictures stay with it to some degree, and then there's an alphabet that they can insert here. But just to show you a couple of things here, we don't have a lot of time to show you, but if you look at the next little chart, then we might come back. You see the N there, the letter N? Well, in the Semitic languages, that is from the word water, mayim. That's a picture of water. And so they took a slice of water and made the M. Have you seen anything like that in the English language? Yes, the letter M. The letter M has two waves on it. We've smoothed it out for the small m, but the capital M still has the waves in it. And in Greek, you actually have two, in their M, they have two waves. In Egypt, it's an N because of the Nile.
Mm-hmm.
So, but all the alphabet can be explained to show you where all the letters came from.
People at home can't see how nuts it's going in here. People so excited over these points.
Yeah, they can't see how excited you people are.
Trust me, at home you're joined with the excitement that's in the room.
But anyway, just thought I'd show you a little bit. It's a tremendous number of, and we couldn't read hieroglyphs for a long time until almost 1800 when they found the Rosetta Stone. And there was a story in hieroglyphs and one in what's called Hieratic, that's another language, and Greek. We couldn't read the two Egyptian scripts at all, but we could read the Greek. And so we were able to decipher hieroglyphs from the Greek.
It's also neat to see how the shapes of some of our letters relate back. You know,
Right.
like the letter A moves from a plow and then turns on from its side to up, and then it gets the crossbar put in the middle, and you're like, oh, so it's the same thing it's always been. It's just rotated around and had some lines added to it.
Right.
So back to the story. Jacob finally says, we're starving. I've heard there's food in Egypt, and so you need to go down there and buy some. And like we heard this morning, he sends 10 of his sons. What I thought was interesting that didn't get mentioned this morning was, look at the quote up there on this screen. What if some accident happens to him? And he's asking about Benjamin. And it gives me chills actually reading that, because what it's telling us in the story at this point is that Jacob still believes that Joseph's death was an accident. And yet the brothers were responsible for Joseph when the accident happened. And now they're wanting to take Benjamin, or he's not going to let Benjamin go at this point, because it's into the custody and the oversight of the brothers again. And what if there's another accident and he loses Benjamin? And I thought that's interesting. We don't usually stop and contemplate that.
Yeah, only 10 of these brothers know what happened.
Right.
Benjamin doesn't know that Benjamin's going to find out the story of what they did when he gets down in Egypt. He doesn't know the story of what his older brothers did.
Yeah. So off they go. Joseph's brothers go to Egypt, and different. This looks like a happy send-off. They're probably starving, like some of us who've missed lunch on a Saturday after we've mowed the yard all day, and you're ready to eat anything. Used to have a friend that used to say, I'm so hungry I could eat the sole of my shoe. And I was like, I don't think I've ever been that hungry. But nonetheless, this looks like a normal trip heading off, but different artistic ideas. And then when they get there, here's the bowing down. And this probably is, like, I wasn't trying to say no one ever bowed down earlier. It's just different context. People out in the street, maybe not. This, where you're coming and asking, because here are foreigners coming to a different country, to a ruler of that country who has food and they don't, and their lives are basically in that person's hands to say, can we have food from you? He could have said no. He could have said, your money's not good here. I won't sell you food. And then what would they have done?
Right.
When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. I thought that was interesting too. I thought Les did a good job of that this morning, of showing us that they don't recognize him. That either means they didn't change that much, or he just has better perception than they do, one or the other.
Yeah, that's true. But he would possibly, you may have friends that you run into you haven't seen in years, and they'll say, "Stan, you got a beard,"
Yep.
and you didn't have that beard then.
Right.
Or they'll say, "Rod, you don't have any hair anymore." And so,
But I also run into friends that I haven't seen since high school or college or whatever, and they still look exactly the same. I mean, they might have some crow's feet or something, but basically you're like, hey, that's so and so, and they still look the same. And then there's some that you see that you're like, oh, I'd have never put that together. I didn't. No, you're in there somewhere. I didn't even know that was you.
yeah, we ran into a family that when I coached baseball, and he played opposite other teams with David against David all the time, and played on all-star teams with David, but knew the family really, really well. And I didn't recognize Bobby at all. I mean, I did not recognize him at all.
Wow. Wow. So yeah, I guess it just depends. So some of these pictures show that. Like I'm not a real huge fan of this one, the way they've got Joseph drawn there. He doesn't look very Egyptian, actually, I don't think, in this picture compared to some of the other ones. He does look a little bit more in this picture like maybe some of his brothers in the background a little bit. But, all the other pictures have him sort of like this, this guy that they would not even have any inkling would be their brother. I don't know I didn't understand the comment this morning about the skin color. Like, maybe just because he's down there for 7 years, he got more tan because he's in the sun. I don't know, but he's not gonna change to looking like an Egyptian as far as that goes, other than the clean shaven and the dress, and maybe even we don't know, okay, but I mean Egyptians were known for makeup and stuff like that, so there could have even been things done to his eyes or to his beard, but I don't think he's going to have as dark a skin as the native Egyptians.
Right.
And so Joseph remembers his dreams, and then he asks, or he makes this charge that they're spies. They are, of course, very upset about that. They do understand, though, I think, why. I read an article that said that would have been something that was happening at that time, that if people came into countries like Egypt, they might be coming in to assess the vulnerabilities that they have and the things that then they could go back and tell their military, hey, we can take them or we cannot. And so not just like he pulled that out of the air and they would have think, well, why would we get accused of being spies? It was actually something people got accused of. So it was probably a routine charge.
Right.
Joseph's brothers state that they're the sons of one man. We heard that this morning. He tells them about being tested. He takes Simeon and locks him up. Tells them that they must go back and then prove that they're not spies by doing that. He imprisoned them all for 3 days, and I put 3 days, I highlighted it because I wondered I know we can't always do this, but it does seem like that's probably something to at least pause and think about. Just like Jonah and the fish for 3 days. What's significant about 3 days? And I can only come up with it must just be foreshadowing to how significant 3 days will be later. I'm not saying that it was anything necessarily then, except it wasn't 2 days and it wasn't 4. So,
right. Yeah, and 3 days would give you, by the third day, you be getting pretty nervous. It gave you time to talk. And it doesn't say so, but I guess he probably put them in jail together.
I would think so too, but I guess where I was going is look at the very next sentence after the highlighted 3 days. On the third day, Joseph said to them, do as I say and you will live.
Right.
Well, I mean, that gives me chills because on the third day, Jonah lived again when he got vomited by the fish. Jesus comes, resurrects, and we all have eternal life because of him. So that statement, on the third day, do as I say and you will live, seems to be in line with every single time we come across 3 days.
Yeah, it's a part of a day, a full day, and a part of a day. That's very, very common. And that's what Jesus, when he was resurrected, part of a day, full day, and a part of a day.
Okay, so these little memes you've probably seen all over the internet. I'm not going to say I told you so, but I told you so. Do you ever think you would find the phrase in the Bible, I told you so? Well, essentially it's there. Genesis 42:22, Reuben says to them, didn't I say to you, don't sin against the boy, Nahar, the young man, but you wouldn't listen. So now we must pay for shedding his blood. However, there's more going on here than our 21st century eyes can see. So first of all, I think it's somewhat comical that we can now say, yeah, the Bible has a story of I told you so. It just doesn't phrase it that way. What's going on beyond our 21st century eyes? Well, how would Reuben arrive at his conclusion? The Hebrew text of verse 22 states this, and also his blood, behold, is sought, which is hard to put into English, right? That's going to make for an awkward English translation. Where does this line of thinking originate? Well, God requires compensation from those who shed innocent blood, Genesis 9:6 with Cain and Abel. In other words, God exacts punishment for the crime of murder. So they're sitting there thinking that their brother is dead because they've told Joseph, and one is no more. They know they didn't do it, but they're assuming they're responsible for it. And so that's how that's how he gets to this deduction that this is what's happening, because they're basically being charged for the murder of Joseph.
Right.
It's a long journey to get there, but that's what the "I told you so" is saying. And so this was also this always interested me in this story from a very young age, that we forget that Joseph can understand everything that they're saying. They can't understand what he's saying. He's using an interpreter, but as they're talking, he doesn't need that interpreter. And of course, he's hearing this before, and he has time to think through how he's going to respond back through the interpreter to them. And he turned away from them because he just really couldn't handle it anymore. He goes, and several different pictures of him weeping and him crying. And when he turned around and spoke to them, he had Simeon taken and tied up before their eyes. And I thought Les did a good job this morning of going over that, why it was Simeon and not Reuben. Better bring your younger brother next time. I think that was your line. In other words, you're welcome to have food. I've taken your money. I'll accept the payment. I'll send you on your way. Life, like he said, after 3 days, life is available to your father and all those back in the land, but you better bring your younger brother next time or things won't go as well.
Yeah, he wanted to make sure they'd bring him, so he kept Simeon.
Right. Well, we could have added more, actually, because I didn't know how much was going to be in the sermon. So let's think about this. So they go home, because we're not really going to cover this next week. We're going to jump to the reconciliation next week. We're going to look at all that goes on there with Jacob coming down. But they make multiple trips. So what we didn't put in detail here this morning in pictures and in slides was the whole concept that Les started going through, which was the soldiers or the army or the Pharaoh's guard, or however you phrase it, went after them, stopped them, found the money in the mouth of their sacks. Or they went home and found the money in the mouth of their sacks on the first trip, and they're all freaked out. Jacob is concerned. He's like, what in the world have you done? How did this happen? He doesn't want to send Benjamin now, even more so probably because of this, because he has no idea what they're going to encounter when they go back. He tells them, take the money that was returned to you, take it back, the silver that's in their sacks. They make a second trip, and that's the trip that they take Benjamin. And then the same thing happens, except the silver cup of Joseph is put in Benjamin's sack as well. And so it's a double problem. They get their money back, they paid for the grain again, but they also get something very important that's known and valuable to Egypt. It's in Joseph's sack, which I think, you tell me if I've got this right, when they first stop them, they say something's been stolen, and if we find it, whoever's sack we find it in, we're arresting. So it wasn't just that they came back. They took Benjamin because Benjamin got arrested because it was in his sack. And now they're pulling their hair out going, oh my goodness, this couldn't have gone any worse. It would have been better if it had been found in somebody else's sack, but it was found in Benjamin's sack. And so they're back in Egypt, and it's at that point that Joseph breaks down. So hop in there and say what I missed or what you want to add, because that's when he cannot continue this, I don't want to call it a charade, but he can't continue this process of investigating them any longer. His emotions won't let him, and like we heard this morning in the sermon, his concern for his father won't let him either, because the text, that's the other thing, and then I'll be quiet. The text says in Hebrew that if Benjamin were to not come home, Jacob's, I think it says Jacob's long hair would grow down to Sheol. something along those lines, which means it would kill him, right?
Yeah, he would die.
Yeah, he would die.
It would be the last stroke. It would be put him in his grave. There are only two guys that are talking every time. It's Reuben and Judah are the two brothers that have the conversations. And Reuben was the firstborn. Remember when he was born earlier in Genesis, Leah had the first child, and so they named him Reuben because Reuben means, look, a boy. That's what the name means. And so, but Reuben lost his position because he had sexual relations with one of the two concubines. And therefore, this will be mentioned again in our lesson next week, I'm sure. When Jacob is dying, he starts talking about what's going to happen to the brothers, to his sons. And it will be a reference there will be, he lost his position. He lost his position as head son, in a sense, because of what he did. And so, but he still pops up all the time. And sometimes he's not very rational, because as Les mentioned this morning, he said, you know, if we don't bring him back, you can kill my two sons. Well, surely he was brighter than that. It's kind of like,
Yeah.
It's like Bathsheba when Adonijah goes and asks, he said, well, I lost the crown to Solomon, but I'd sure like to have that concubine that David had. And I think Bathsheba knew all the time what was going to happen. She acted naive and went to Solomon and said, he wants that concubine. And Solomon said, you might as well give him the kingdom. And then they execute Adonijah. I think she knew all the time.
Yeah.
Well, here, Reuben knew Jacob would not execute his two
Yeah,
sons.
and I think that's what I was getting at, and I think that's very important the way you said it, because what we may say, well, I don't know, maybe we don't, but I think sometimes when we hear something like we did this morning and we think through the story again, we might be sitting there saying, because Les said a comment of, there wasn't a whole lot of time. They needed to get food back to Jacob because he's starving to death. And you think to yourself, oh, was he just kind of trifling with them? I mean, is he just kind of saying, these are my brothers, and let me just draw this out a little bit, and let me do this other stuff? Well, I don't think so. But look at how it comes to an end real quickly. And I think the reason it comes to an end is he asks, is my father still alive? And he finds out that he is. He knows that if Benjamin doesn't go back, his father will die before he gets to see him. And I think that's how grave of a situation it was. Just the news of Benjamin being kept, if they had gone back after that second trip without him, would have killed Jacob. Joseph would have never been able to have the reunion. And I think that's what was actually why, that was the straw that broke the camel's back, that he says, okay, here guys, I'm your brother. You know, let's just cut to the chase, because he wanted to get on to that next step, which was seeing his dad, right?
Yeah, and Les made a really good point about it. It's 22 years later, since he got the robe at age 17. Benjamin is at least 25, 26, 27 years old. Because next week, as you'll see, when he comes down to Egypt the second time where they bring their families down, he brings his 10 sons with him, and they're named. It's not like, oh, did they miss this number when they were copying the number? No, he brought his 10 sons who are names. So he's in his 20s. And that word boy that you see in the translation all the time, that's the Hebrew word na'ar. He was now the crown sheik. Joseph had been the crown sheik. Mm-hmm. And later, Benjamin became the crown sheik when he got old enough. And and this is going to be a shock to Benjamin when he hears all this about what his brothers had done.
So next week, we're going to tie all this up. We'll have the reconciliation scene. We'll have, as Dr. Cloud said, Jacob coming down, 10 sons of Benjamin coming down. The questions that have been up there for a while we've been talking, have you ever had something between you and another person that they brought back up at a later point? And I'm sure you have. I have. It's always interesting when that happens. So think about that. What Joseph could have done? Because he could have been like, oh, sure, now you need food, but let's remember what you did to me. Number two, have you ever been tempted to say, I told you so? Hopefully in a good way. Not in a bad way. And so I'd like to end by just reading this prayer that I think encompasses everything and sets the stage for next week. So here we go. God, we come to you in prayer for the restoration of our relationship. We have been through so much together, and we have each made mistakes along the way. We are sorry for those mistakes and ask that you help us to forgive each other and move forward with a fresh start. Bless the homes where your people live, O God, and strengthen the bonds of love between husband and wife, parent and child, sisters and brothers. Make our homes places of refuge and sources of strength where we support and encourage each other. When conflict and tension arise, help us work out our differences in honest dialogue, trusting that you will give us grace to forgive and strength to love in even the most difficult times. Amen.
Amen.
Have a blessed day, and we'll finish Joseph next week.